This first Friday, we are extremely fortunate that Dr. Hanna has agreed to trek from the city out here and do a face-to-face presentation with you folks. I think we have about 6 people who plan to pop in and out on virtually. You'll see them kind of flash on the screen. She won't want to look or care about it because when she starts talking, I want that to be the kind of recording that you can hear. I save them. I put them up on the website on our First Friday site. So they will be there, and Sister Callista Royce is there. If you were to search it, it's there as well. I always tell faculty, when you really are strapped for having a nice 1-hour lecture, you get a 1-hour lecture from a cast of wonderful people. And as I said, with Dr. Hanna, who's going to talk to us, I had said to the faculty meeting on Wednesday that her work on the silent factors that increase nursing work in repositioning patients, I think is useful for everyone. Clinical practice 101 and beyond. But what Debra likes to show, and what I think is worth having a look at, is the way she did the data collection and the way she did the analysis. So bear with her. Leading to, I said, keep the numbers relatively low. Don't do screens and screens and screens. Oh, you have a few. But mostly it's the idiosyncrasies of data collection that those of us who are researchers understand, those of us who want to be or who intend to become nurse researchers will get to learn a little bit about. So with that, I hope, reasonable introduction, I'm going to get you started. And as I said, once you're up, first slide, and you're off and running, and that's out of your way. It didn't go. There it goes. All right, that's out of your way. So down arrows, not hot. Debra Hanna.
Thank you, Dr. Fee. Thank you, everybody, for being here online and in the room. When I was preparing this, it was a little bit like a debriefing after the research study itself. So I hope I don't have too many screens to show you, but I'm going to talk about this study now that it's over, in a certain sense, looking back at how it was. The study was called Learning About Turning, a report of a mailed survey of nurses' work to reposition patients. And the Learning About Turning, I wanted to get a really good title for it that was kind of catchy. And we kept calling it the Turning Study when I first started working on this whole thing. So I ended up at the end of the study with the team, which included Anne-Marie Perazek, and Peg Duffy was my doctoral student at the time, but she was working in a similar area in her own dissertation. And Larry DiFiore from the Department of Math, he helped us a lot with some of the statistics, as did Anne-Marie. And
might have to click in the middle of it to start to be able to use a down arrow. You have to get rid of the bar. Click right there in the middle, and then use the bar. The arrows.
Okay, very good. So just briefly, a few brief things. I had some branch funding. I applied originally to the Columbia University Presbyterian Hospital School of Nursing Alumni Association, and I was given a small amount of money to do the study. And the study, I'll talk about a little bit how it started in a few seconds, but first I had that, and then I realized I needed a lot more money. So I started to apply to other places, including, I did apply for Sigma Theta Tau, I applied for A&F, and I didn't get any of those, although I kept getting very nice and helpful critiques. So it kept delaying the start of the study because I really realized that to do it the way I wanted to do it, I needed a lot more money. But I did get a Molloy College faculty research grant, and that was very helpful combined with the other one. The additional resources that I had included the consultants of Dr. Jacqueline Dieneman, who came to us when we first started the program, and that was the courtesy of the HRSA grant that Dr. Feig had. And of course, Dr. Lawrence DiFiore, he started out as a consultant on statistics, and then he sort of joined in the rest of what we were doing. I had good secretarial assistance from Cindy Lynch in the nursing department originally, and then I had 3 graduate assistants over time. And Susanna Chavez was the one who did the majority of a lot of data entry, helping with the data cleaning. I mean, she just did a lot of work with that. But I had had 2 previous ones, Denise Delina and Claudia Mayorga, who also helped with the data entry early in the study. So how did I get to this learning about turning study? The background is that, all of us experience the problem of staffing no matter what role we're in. And I had already seen it as a staff nurse. I had already seen it as a clinical specialist. I saw it as a nurse manager, and I saw it as an assistant director. Because when you don't have enough staff to staff the units, and you're on the nurse manager or the assistant director side, you can't pull people out of the wall, and you can't, use Play-Doh to make a person or a nurse. And as a clinical specialist, I often saw the results of poor staffing because I was the one that they would call when there were problems, and I had to go help fix the problems and educate the staff. But as a staff nurse, I really felt the lack of staffing because I went back into staff nursing many times in my career as I was advancing in my education, including after my stint as a nurse manager when I already had a doctoral degree. So the problem was, the reason that this study came about was because as a nurse manager, I was required to attend a monthly meeting on pressure ulcers. And we had to look at our pressure ulcer rates, and we had to figure out what to do. And at one of the meetings, I said, if I had more staff, I wouldn't have problems. But I can't seem to get enough staff. And I have approached it from so many different angles. And I had also said to my clinical director at one point, because she kept saying, oh no, the staffing is perfect for you. And I said, no, the math is not good. Okay? The math is wrong. And she said, well, what other math is there? And I said at the time, I don't know. But somehow the math is not supporting my staff. They're working like dogs and they can't get the work done, So because I had complained about this in this meeting, then other people on the committee said, we should probably study that. And I thought, all right, you're a doctorally prepared nurse manager. You should probably study that. That's correct. So that's how it all started. That was somewhere around 2004 or so. Now, my purpose of the study, as it evolved over time with all those critiques and everything, the purpose was to gather descriptive data about what I called 4 silent factors of nurses' work and their work environments that might affect repositioning patients at high risk for pressure ulcers, and that might also affect nurses' decision-making when prioritizing care tasks. So I had this idea in mind, when I was doing all the complaining, that there were things that were just not included when people did staffing, and I had done staffing, and I had this formula that I was supposed to use, and when I first saw the formula, I was like, wait a minute. I had nurses who had to deal with death and dying, and who had to help people who were coping with, serious issues on the floor. My background was neuro, so we would get a lot of people who had a sudden head injury or spinal cord injury from a bike accident on the West Side Highway or on Riverside Drive. And so those kinds of things, they take a lot of time from nurses, but there are even other things that take time from nurses that cost nurses time and effort in their work that are not included in acuity systems or patient classification systems or all this other stuff. And I understand that now there is a staffing software, and Peg Duffy, who was working with me on this, her dissertation was looking at the staffing software, and she finally came to something about that she saw through her analysis. And then at the end, we realized that there were a lot of overlap in, what we all kind of saw. So the literature review, this was a little bit problematic when I finally published the study and was submitting the manuscript, because the editor wanted me to do a very nice tree that you see now in all the journals. I didn't have that tree. I had been collecting things about repositioning frequency, nurses' work in general to prevent pressure ulcers, about pressure ulcers itself, about staffing. I had so many different topics, but I had collected that stuff from the time I was a CNS in the early 90s. So she kept saying to me, which databases did you use? And I knew at a certain point, yes, I had gone to CINAHL, and I had done certain terms. So I had some part of that, but I didn't have it in the nice, neat way that she wanted. So she threw out a lot of my literature in the final publication, but that was okay because I still used other work that was, I think, very important. I used Keeping Patients Safe, which was an IOM report in 2004. And then some of those things were updated in 2008, and the AHRQ has them all archived about nursing and staffing and nurses' work and everything. So I used another report on turbulence by Bonnie Jennings. And then I did look in at nurses' work and obesity with Clostridium difficile, with restraints and staffing levels. And when I started writing the study in 2004, I used, which was very timely at the time, the 2002 comprehensive review in the annual review of nursing research by Courtney Leiter on pressure ulcers. It was really phenomenal. And at that time, I was at Columbia Presbyterian, so I went down into the Armand Hammer building, which is where they have all of their, they had all of their journals. They no longer have them now that way. And I sat there looking at the original articles from the 1930s and the 1950s that gave us the Q2H turning frequency, because I wanted to know how did they do that, and they did it with research on dogs. And I had an article that was, I think, very important that's never been replicated, which probably should be replicated, from, I think, the late 80s or the early 1990s. It always impressed me because it was a kind of a lab study where somebody recruited these people in, elderly people, to come and lie in bed on their side for a certain number of hours, and she tested their pressure to their skin. She looked at redness, and she looked at other factors, and she found that when people were on the right side, they could only tolerate about an hour, but on the left side, they could tolerate 2 hours. And so her idea was, well, the reason is because your pulmonary arteries and cardiac and all that other stuff is different from right to left, and that's probably the answer. But then why wouldn't we change it to Q1 hours when you're on your right side and leave it to Q2 hours when you're on your left? So that was something that was kind of in the back of my mind, and of course that did not appear in the article because she definitely didn't want something that was more than 3 years old. Anyway, so that was a little bit about my literature review. But because of the literature review, I started to narrow down my options as to what I wanted to study, because I didn't want to study everything. I just wanted to study a couple of things. And I had gone to AHRQ to learn how to use the HCAPNet database, and so I did a database search. And this is what I found. Now, they're going to change their database search on December 31st, the look of it and everything. And they currently have up there some like videos that you can learn, like you can do self-learning of how to use it. But at the time, I looked at what it was. I looked for a 15-year trend, and I was accessing this in 2011, and the data, the most recent data would be 2008, because it takes 3 years for the states to collect their data from all the hospitals in their states, process their data, send it to AHRQ. AHRQ processes it and collapses it all together for a national sample. And HCAP stands for the Healthcare Utilization Project. And so this actually shows you how many times these diagnoses were used. Now, I used the clinical classification software, which was actually Dr. Feig's, chairperson of her committee, developed that. Virginia Saba, yeah. And what I did was I was putting in, different diagnoses and looking for obesity. And the first cases of obesity, morbid obesity, were in 1995 in the database. So I didn't have 15 years of that, but you can see that in 2008 it had already increased by 29 times, which means that when people take something like, and I've argued this a few times with people in the clinical setting, like now they record BMI, your body mass index, but the body mass index is like a number that's calculated against your height and weight. So Will Chamberlain, who was like, a really tall basketball player, but very slender for his height, would probably not have a huge body mass index, but yet he would be very heavy to try to turn and lift and reposition if he was totally dependent every 2 hours. So I wanted to use weight by pounds and not body mass index, which is what I did in the study. I used mechanical ventilation, and I'm kind of glad that I went back to 1993 because that was almost one of the watershed years of when all the downsizing was happening. And it was when a lot of the ambulatory services were finally blossoming all over the place. And what happened was in the hospital systems, if some of you might remember, is that we used to have people who walked in the hallways. And now in an acute care facility, someplace like in the city hospitals, people do not walk except with your staff, okay? Only the staff are walking from room to room. They're kind of running from room to room. But the patients, if you're able to walk in the hospital, then you should be in ambulatory services. And so therefore, the mechanical ventilators that we had in 1993 were primarily located in the ICU areas. Now, the mechanical ventilators, if you're in a hospital setting, are also located on floor care settings and also in rehab and nursing homes and other places like that. So because you have to have approval for how many ventilator beds you can have, we only went up almost 2 times in the 15-year period. But that is a significant increase in terms of that, because I used mechanical ventilation as a kind of a proxy, I guess you would call it, for technology. And technology, once you have a mechanical ventilator, I mean, it's pretty much guaranteed that you're going to have IV fluids with IV pumps. You're going to have Foley catheter that you have to do the eyes and O's. You're going to have sometimes, a lot of times, a feeding tube with another pump. So even if you're on floor care on a mechanical ventilator, there's a lot of increased technology and alarms to respond to. I added Clostridium difficile, and then you see that I did it a couple of different ways. I did C. diff was 85,000 in 1993, and it increased 4-fold by 2008. But then I also just looked up diarrhea, which was not associated with Clostridium difficile, and that was 13 times higher, which now that we've had all this problem with our antibiotics, we want to pull back on the antibiotics, and now that people are talking about prebiotics and probiotics and getting your intestinal flora back in shape, you can see the kind of problem that we were having over time. And then fecal incontinence increased 3 times, but I was thinking about this when I was actually doing this table. I noticed that we have different kinds of rectal tubes and other types of ways to handle fecal incontinence, which is like the steady stream of diarrhea that is even beyond Clostridium difficile and just regular diarrhea. So that led me to the 4 silent factors, and the silent factors you can see in the bold are time on task, physical burden, technology, and complexity of care. So the time on task has to do with what some of the authors who are working in this area call the process factors. Like, how long does it actually take you in minutes to do the work? How long does it take you in minutes to collect the staff to do the work? And then once you've collected the staff to help you and then you're doing the work, what is that total time that you're doing for everybody all together? And that's the one that I'm going to analyze here the most, and that's the one that I kept in the article that we published because the editor would not let me do all the other ones in the article. So Anne-Marie and I are going to move on to our second article pretty soon. Physical burden was weight in pounds, patient weight in pounds, which, as you saw, increased so much. And I put the adult body weight in 4 categories. Then technology I already explained as mechanical ventilator, but I also considered mental status and physical restraints, which you'll see when I show you the slides. And then finally, complexity of care, which people had started to talk about maybe around, in the early 2000s, and it was starting to be studied more by the time I was doing my own study. So the way I looked at it was Clostridium difficile with contact isolation, which is very complex care. If you have to mask, gown, and glove, go into the room, you're taking care of somebody who's having diarrhea like maybe 12 times a shift, like almost hourly, doing a complete linen change, doing almost, bed bath, and trying to get the patient comfortable again, then, unmasking, ungowning, and coming out, and then going on to your next patient pretty soon, So I looked at considering fecal incontinence and physical restraints. So I'm going to talk briefly about the method. I decided, because I had this conversation originally in the committee said, oh, well, let's ask our nurses what they think. And I said, well, we could, yeah, we could ask our nurses what they think, but let's do it by a mailed survey. And they're like, no, we can email them. And I'm like, no, because then they have no privacy, because you have work emails and then you can gain access to their data. So let's do a surface mailed survey. That was like my bottom line, which became like a little bit of a problem.
2008, I think we started talking about that. Right.
So,
How many times you lick a stamp on it?
oh yeah,
Among other things.
way more than that. But so the mailed survey, first of all, you have to have an accurate, up-to-date home address list that represents your target population. And I thought I knew of one that I could use, and I did know of one that I could use, but then as it turned out, I didn't actually, it wasn't that up-to-date, and it wasn't that accurate. You could also do SurveyMonkey, but again, how do you do that if you're going to send it to a work email and then have other people possibly have access to that? So SurveyMonkey doesn't have to go through a work site. It can go through private emails, but that means that we would have to get people's personal emails and email them separately. And then just to let you know in terms of the methods, there's something else called CADI, which is the computer-assisted telephone interviews. That's what you usually get at 8 o'clock at night when people are calling for your survey information. So we weren't going to do that. So there are pros and cons to both. So the pros, the reason why I really wanted to do the surface mailed survey was because it would afford privacy and anonymity to the nurses who could answer. And it would avoid the workplace emails, and it also would permit extra info to be written into the survey before they mailed it back to me. And so I could obtain explanations. Now this is a little survey that I actually mailed out to people, and you can see that it was pretty easy, generally speaking, to fill out. Do you want to send it? Yeah. The cons of a surface mailed survey is extremely labor intensive. It requires the hand input of all the data. It's very expensive due to printing, postage, and other elements. And it usually requires several mailings in order for non-respondents to achieve a high response rate. So if you look at Don Dillman's work, which he's kind of like the master of surface mailed surveys, he also talks about the week in the year that you should mail certain surveys. So like I really wanted this to go out before like around the last week of September or the first week of October, because that's the 1 week of the year that most people are home because they're not on vacation and they haven't usually started Christmas shopping yet. And they're still helping kids with homework and stuff like that, so they're there. And, but also the mail workers haven't changed to the temporary mail workers. But my first survey went out on December 22nd, much to my chagrin.
Oh, no.
Very bad. Yeah. So I have here a little slide about what's needed for a high-quality mailed survey. That's why I said this was almost like a debriefing for me to put this whole thing together, because it really makes me think about how things actually worked out. So I had learned about this in a course that I took. I took about 4 courses in survey and instrument development and things like that in my doctoral studies. But there are 4 kinds of errors: sampling error, coverage error, measurement error, and non-response error. Now, sampling error is to what extent does a sample represent the population? And I would say that everybody who answered was really a registered nurse, and so I would say I got my target population in general. Coverage error has to do with whether or not the list included all the elements of the target population. And the first list that I had included elements of like retired people, people who had passed away, and I was getting the, the thing from the post office saying deceased, 2 years ago. So one of my lists was not as good as one of the other lists. Measurement error has to do with when the responses are inaccurate or imprecise and can't be compared in a usual way to other responses. And I didn't have too much of that, I think. And non-response error is when do the people who do not respond differ significantly from those who do. So I would say that I was happy with the responses that I had because I sent this thing in a mailed survey. When they couldn't answer an item, like for instance, some people said, we're not allowed to have patients over 250 pounds in our unit, or we're not allowed, because I have to go to bariatric unit, we're not allowed to have patients with restraints on our unit at all. So they couldn't answer those items. So I was like, oh, okay, well, that explains that, you know. So, did you have a question?
No, I was just waiting.
And I also used this credibility scale for small samples from this book by Rossi, Wright, and Anderson. It was printed in 1983. I first bought it in 2001 when I took the course, and the 1983 version is still out there unchanged in an ebook online through someplace in London. And it's an excellent, excellent book about all the theory behind surface mail surveys. But this credibility scale for small samples has to do with how you set up your sample and how you think about it ahead of time, so that when you come to write about it in the journal article, if you can have a good, if you can answer all the questions well, then that helps you when you're setting everything up in the beginning. So I did use that when I was setting up the study. So how did it work? Okay, the NISNA, I went to NISNA because NISNA permitted you at that time to select if you wanted direct care nurses or not, if you wanted critical care or med-surg, if you wanted a particular kind of med-surg like ortho or, you know, medical or whatever. So I did that. I did all the selections, and then what happened was they had a little coup d'etat at NISNA, for those of you who might remember, and NISNA was leaving the ANA, and so the man that I was dealing with, he called me one day and he said, I'm very sorry, but I can't really send you exactly what you wanted anymore because they no longer have that access, but I can send you something that's kind of similar. Would you like that? And I said, all right. And so that's the one that had the people who had died on it, you know, and the people who were retired. And so I had a very low response rate with that. That was also the one that went out on December 22nd, so it's not entirely the fault of that list. But I did have a problem sample coverage with that. And then I moved on to the Academy of Med-Surg Nurses, who gave me their list, which was a national sample. And I used that for the second and third rounds, and that was very up to date. And if somebody was like a nurse manager and not in direct care, it pretty much said it on the list. So I took their names out of the list and I just sent it to staff nurses. So you see the difference in my response rates. December 22nd, 13%, not good. The other study for one-time mailing, 22% for all 3 rounds in general, but I think the ANS and nurses were a little bit higher than that, and they were pulled down by the 13%. So in general, I did have good materials, and I worked very hard on formatting my, you know, the survey. And it was an investigator-developed survey booklet, and people that I asked to look at things ahead of time, you know, they were like, oh, aren't you going to get the reliabilities of this? And I'm like, how do you get the reliabilities of somebody's opinion? Like, I mean, it's not like an attitude scale. It was more like, you know, what do you think, how long do you think it takes you to gather your workers and do this work? So the parts where I could do reliabilities, I did. My 4 research questions were, do silent factors significantly increase the nursing work of repositioning patients at high risk for developing pressure ulcers? And then from that, which work-related or patient conditions are most likely to impede nurses' timely repositioning of patients? And then I had, does nursing work intensity affect nursing work process related to repositioning patients? Because there was a scale in the public domain that had been put out by Linda Hagan and Patricia Patrician on, it was the revised nursing work intensity scale. So I used a portion of that, which again, people said, use the whole thing, don't use a portion. And I was like, no, it'll add too many items to my survey and that'll be too much test burden. And in the end, I was like, should have used the whole thing. So, and you'll see why when I do the reliabilities. And then the 4th one was, do patients, which patients do nurses prioritize into a later or last category when repositioning is needed? So I gave 4 scenarios and asked people to rate them 1, 2, 3, and 4. I developed a data analysis grid ahead of time, so I put all of my questions on the one side and then my specific aims for each of those. And then I tried to work through what variables I was actually, which items were going to be this variable, and then which test would I do with that analysis, and if I needed to have a normal distribution and I didn't, what was my alternative statistical test? So this was stuff that I worked out when I was doing the proposal. And that was actually very helpful because after I had all this data and you start looking at your whole grid of SPSS, it's like, where do I begin? Okay. All right, so I started really with univariate descriptive statistics, and I looked at each of the items, and I had an N of 429 usable surveys returned. And the quality of the data, some of the variables dropped very low, like for instance the restraints one, which a lot of people couldn't do, that dropped very low. But I still used those to average things out because that's what I was really doing with the survey. And most of my missing data, as I said, were well explained by notes in the margins by the nurses. So now there was one other thing, because the critical care nurses mainly came from the NICE-Med database and not from the med-surg nurses database, I had relatively a small number of critical care nurses compared to the number of med-surg nurses. So that's kind of a limitation of the study when I'm comparing all, looking at my numbers and statistics. But let's work through silent factor number one, the physical burden or patient weight. So this was, do silent factors significantly increase the nursing work, and also known as how much time and how many people are needed to turn and reposition patients with different clinical conditions. And this was the bottom line reason why I really did the study. So you can see here that in the minutes to reposition patients based on weight, is it okay if I start down here? This line
Don't touch the screen though, it's touch sensitive, we'll go to the next one.
Sorry. I have the groups are 200, 300, 400, and 500 pounds, but this is the time to gather workers. This is the time after you gather workers to complete the task, and that's the total time. So you can see that for a 200-pound patient, it's almost 16 minutes to turn and reposition a patient of 200 pounds. And then it goes steadily up to almost 31 minutes for a patient who's about 500 pounds, which is nearly twice as long as it takes for the 200-pound patient. And you can also see that the number of workers gathered and needed in the dark column is the number of workers that they actually gathered, but the light column is the number of workers that they thought they needed. Now, a lot of those nurses who were in the 2.26 column wrote notes that said, I have no coworkers together, I always work alone. And that was like stunning. When I saw that, you know, many times over in the reports, it was like, oh my goodness, you know. So, so you can see that as people get heavier, by the time you're turning a 500-pound patient, you must have at least 4 workers to turn the patient. And that is, to me, that's pretty slim pickings for enough workers, because I always think a 500-pound patient, you need more like 6 workers to turn that patient, honestly. And the ideal, they said, was about 5, a little more than 5 workers. So here's where the math finally gets interesting. I took the math of a 200-pound patient being repositioned by 2.26 actual workers in 15.53 minutes, meant that it took 7.0 worker hours in 24 hours to reposition that one patient. And we reposition patients, you know, every 2 hours, okay? So that's 7 worker hours to do the Q2-hour repositioning of that one patient. But most units don't have just one patient, so that's the next slide. But if you have a 500-pound patient being repositioned by 4.08 actual workers in 30.6 minutes, that means it takes 24.96 worker hours in 24 to reposition that one patient for every 2 hours. So that's roughly about 25 hours a day for that one patient. Now, I wonder, is there a way, maybe, is there a way to get rid of this little thing?
Yeah, click off the X. That little X right there.
Yes.
Just click off the X.
Okay, so that you can see what this whole thing says. All right, so I divided up this whole thing into 2 staffing plans. One staffing plan is staffing plan 1, no variation in patients, where we have 24 beds on the unit or 36 beds on the unit. Let's just work at the 24 beds. You have 24 patients, about 200 pounds each, that requires 7 worker hours a day. So that's 168 worker hours a day just to turn the patient's Q2H. So that's your basic staffing, is like your 7 workers. But now you have, I'm going to put this back here so you can see that this is a 25% variation in patient characteristics. So 75% of your patients weigh 200 pounds and 25% of them weigh 500 pounds. So that means that now we're doing the math for 18 patients in this group and 6 patients in that group, and we need 276 worker hours, or 11 and a half workers to do that work for a 25% variation. So that means that when nurses call the staffing office and they say we're really short-staffed and we need more help, do they ever send 5 workers? No. Okay? No. If they can, they send you 1. If they can. Okay? If they have an extra person to send. So this is some of the math. And I hate to say it, but like the larger that your unit gets than 36 beds, you need like an additional 7 workers. So this is why some of the, idea that the math is wrong is because it's wrong. So, and the thing is that this was only one little thing that we were looking at. So now let me see if I can go back here. Oh, okay. Now, this gets on to the next silent factor of technology. And remember that before I used patient weight on the bottom. So here I used mental status on the bottom of cooperative, confused, combative, and 4-point restraints. And you can see that the orange line on the bottom is to gather workers. And again, it's not quite twice as many by the time you get to 4-point restraints, but you need more workers. And you need, to complete the task, you need almost not quite twice as much for 4-point restraints or for combative, but it's like significantly higher. So this is something that we still need to do some of the math and to figure out, but mental status is not something that is normally looked at with traditional patient acuities and patient classification. And I'm not sure if they're using mental status yet on the software. Should they? I don't remember that being one of the factors. But they might start including it soon because it's being reported in the literature related to people's ability to do their work. Another thing that was interesting was that the number of workers gathered when patients are on mechanical ventilation, it actually goes down when the people are confused. I thought that was kind of interesting. And I guess there are a couple of explanations that I could give to that. I mean, maybe people think it's easier to deal with somebody who's confused, and a lot of people are confused, but like pleasantly confused, so they're almost more cooperative in a way. And you can go in there and you can do the work, and maybe you don't need to have as many people, but sometimes even though people are cooperative, they could still be more demanding when they're fully awake and alert. So that might be one possible explanation. But by the time people are combative, you can see that combative and 4-point restraints makes it a little bit more difficult to do the work. So the length of time combined with the number of people needed is, to me, one of the keys to this whole problem that we've had with staffing. Now, this was the complex care, and this had to do with C. difficile and fecal incontinence. I included mental status with this as well. So I compared, in the first group, cooperative patient with no incontinence with cooperative and fecal incontinence. Now, this would be, the cooperative no incontinence patient would be closer to like the 200-pound patient. So all of these things, as they go over time and they start building up more elements of what you have to deal with when you're in the room with the patient, are increasing the time and also increasing the number of people. So that's the number of people needed for all of those categories. Now, we used the revised nurses work index, and I did do comparison psychometric testing of the whole scale that they reported in the literature and my partial scale that I used, and this is what I got. The total scale, they had a great Cronbach's alpha of 0.96. My partial scale of 16 selected items was 0.79, so not as high, but it's all right. Yeah. And then you can see that all the subscales came out about the same as what they had, so that was pretty good. Now, we did a logistic regression with odds ratio, and to answer question 2, which work-related or patient conditions are most likely to impede nurses' timely repositioning patients, we entered a few things. First, we used the revised nurses work index scale because they keep saying that magnet hospitals have happier, friendlier places, and so they can do their work more easily, blah, blah, blah. We used coworker availability. We used linen availability, which I have a thing in there, is your linen easily available or not easily available? And I have this whole thing on one of the items is how long do you have to, how much distance do you have to walk to get your linens? And I parceled it out in terms of stretchers. I think the highest one was like 33 stretchers. You have to walk the distance of 33 stretchers, okay? So long distance burden was one, and then pillow availability. And we picked the scenario, when you had the 4 scenarios, which would you do first? Scenario 3 was really the correct answer, but they were tough scenarios because they all had some kind of element of urgency to them for different reasons. So this is how it all worked out. You can see the P statistic for coworker availability was the most important one. That's the most significant. And the odds are, more than 2.5 times that coworker availability is going to influence if you're going to take care of the most needy patient first. And you might put that most needy patient last because the most needy patient is too heavy, it's too complex, and you can't get enough workers quickly enough to help that one patient. So while you're still trying to crawl around and help get workers to help that patient, you could still probably help another patient or 2 other patients. So that's sort of how I looked at the rationale for that. The second thing about does nursing work intensity affect nursing work process related to repositioning patients? That was not a statistically significant predictor. And you can see here that the top score, which I have in bold, is 0.733, which means it's not at all significant. And, there's nothing about that that was to write home about, except that if you have a nice work environment and you don't have enough coworkers, the basic message is you need coworkers to do your work, no matter how much people smile at you, Now, there were you saw from my data analysis group that there were a lot of other statistics that I had planned, and one of them was to do chi-square analyses of some of the other items that I had. These were categorical variables, and then I wanted to do some MANOVAs, which I haven't gotten around to doing yet, but we will do them one day. Anne Marie, maybe Larry and I, okay, and others. So here was one that I asked. I asked about, do you have enough equipment, lifting equipment on your unit? And if so, and then the next question was, do you use lifting equipment? So people who had enough equipment used it, 69%, and people who did not have enough equipment did not use it, 72%. Then the people who had enough equipment and didn't use it, was like about almost 30%. But the thing that was stunning to me was that the people who did not have enough equipment and still used it was about 30%. So I thought, wow, that means that those people have to go searching for the equipment. They probably have to go to other units to get the equipment. They might not have enough equipment on the unit, but they're going to wait their turn to use the equipment because they really need it. And who would they need it for except the people who are really heavy? And that would also delay the time of not only gathering the workers, which is all I asked for, but I didn't ask a question about how long does it take you to gather the equipment you need. So that was like a little thing that was kind of interesting to me. So then I thought, I wonder if there's a difference between the critical care and the non-critical care nurses. So the non-critical care nurses, the med-surg nurses, they used it about 50% of the time, and they didn't use it about 50% of the time. But the critical care nurses, they used it only about 25% of the time, and about a third of the time, 3/4 of the time, they didn't use it. And I thought that was really weird, because I thought, gee, those people in ICU are very, very heavy. Why wouldn't you use the lifting equipment to help, your patients? So then I looked at the sleep surface by work environment, and now you see a big difference between med-surg nurses and critical care nurses. I included in the items a standard mattress, which meant firm and absolutely, nothing that was going to help the patient. I included low pressure and low air loss mattresses, and I included the advanced mattress of pressure redistribution beds, which are kind of the newer beds. And maybe they're not so new anymore, probably about 10 years out there, whatever. But anyway, they were new at the time I was writing this. But the med-surg nurses generally have the standard mattress or low pressure and low air loss mattresses, which are not enough really when you have people who are at high risk for pressure ulcers. And they don't generally have the advanced pressure redistribution beds. But the critical care nurses, almost like half of them had pressure redistribution beds, and hardly any of them, like 16.5%, had standard mattresses. And then about, a little bit more than a third had the low pressure and low air loss mattresses. So that shows you, to me, what it said was that maybe they didn't use certain equipment in critical care because they had other equipment that compensated. And when I looked at that, then this is kind of like where we want to go with the next article about the nursing administration, has to do with as pieces of equipment change and the use changes, then you could use your dollars more effectively. Like those people who are still buying lifting equipment, maybe it would be better spent on buying better mattresses. And if they were to use a survey like ours, maybe they could figure out what are your nurses actually doing, so what would make the best purchasing decision for you, that kind of thing. So here are some of my lessons learned. One of them is you need a list that provides good sample coverage of the target population. The NISNA list, they had a database of 38,000 plus nurses, and then in the end, because of their coup d'etat, they couldn't really do what I had asked originally, which is, that's just like life happens, life intervenes. And so then I needed to find another list because I knew I couldn't do that a second time or for a third round. But the AACN, I approached the critical care nurses, and they actually do have a process to wrench their list. And it's a little bit complicated. And then I thought it through, and I thought of the cost. And then I decided, no, maybe not. I think I went with the Academy of Med-Surg Nurses. And they gave me a huge list of names that also had, like I said, the nurse manager category and things like that on it. So I could tell that I was sending it to just Med-Surg nurses. Now, what I did was I started out with the idea that I would like so many responses to come back to me. So I only had a certain number of dollars to spend on postage and all that other stuff. And I will tell you about another lesson that I learned and then how I made amends for this in my second and third mailings. I knew that I was only going to mail to each person once and only once. So when I had the NISNA list and then I had the Academy of Med-Surg Nurses who had nurses from New York, I had to actually check to make sure that I didn't have any duplicates in there because I didn't want to mail to one nurse twice. But another lesson that I learned, I couldn't use business reply envelopes for the response, which would have been much more cost efficient because we didn't have that at that time. And I had to use first class postage. And after I sent everything out for the first round, the first class postage changed a month later. So people who were late responders after the Christmas holidays, when they were finally getting around to it, the post office sent me a notice that they had things to deliver that they wouldn't deliver. So I probably did have a higher response rate, but I just couldn't get my responses delivered to me. So that was a big lesson that I learned there because, again, Don Dillman says, last week of September, first week of October, and he was right. But then I said to myself, well, let's see, how much more money do I have left to do more printings and mailings? So I used the college printer and didn't actually go with the specifications because I asked for the same exact size envelope to mail the mailings, and the lady gave me 2 inches larger on the envelopes, which meant that I had to change my postage amount for the outgoing and also for the incoming. So I said to her at the time, I said, and can you fold the inside envelopes? Because the inside envelopes are all going to be addressed to me. And she had said, oh, yeah, we could do that. But then she thought, oh, it'd be just better if you have the larger 2-inch envelope going out, and we don't have to fold that other envelope. So again, I just thought, okay, I'm coming up to summer vacation, so I can't wait and have another disaster with my mailing. So I just went with the extra cost and paid for it out of my pocket and just sent it out. But that was another thing, that having all of your stuff in advance and knowing when you're going to do your mailing, you have to sort of almost work backwards on your calendar to do all this. And then I really needed help early on to manage my workflow, and I did have help from, like, Cindy in the nursing office gave me help with the lists and labels and things like that. But I could have used other help, you know, just physical hands-on help for, like, stamps. Yes.
Lick 'em, stick 'em team is what I call them.
Yeah, the stamps and the stuffing of the envelopes and all that other stuff. So, never more lessons learned. The smaller book that I found was better than a larger sheet of paper. I used instruments in the public domain, but again, I should not have changed that instrument. I thought the data analysis grid helped me a great deal, and also I used table shells originally, which are in Denise Pellet's, one of her books. She talks about using table shells, and I had learned that, and I thought, if you have an idea of how your how your data are going to look in the final publication when you're setting up your proposal, then one of the ideas that one of my teachers had was, when you develop your proposal, you should write it with your manuscript in mind. Because for quantitative research, all of your stuff that you're doing, for your introduction, your background, your literature review, your questions, they're all done. You're not going to change that. So pretty much, if it's out there in a final form for you, then all you have to do is do your data analysis and put them into the table shells that you've already set up, and then do your discussion and conclusions, and that's how people can be very highly productive. Something that I wish I could be someday. So what are our next steps are to continue the analysis of data with nurse administrators in mind, which I shared with you some of those ideas. And I'd like to work with, particularly with Peg Duffy and Anne-Marie, if you'd like to do that, and with others, on this idea of the concept analysis of silent factors, because I think it's not so much silent factors as it is unrecognized work or unacknowledged work, and that's not currently in those staffing systems or patient acuities or, you know, patient classifications. And then I'd like to develop a follow-up study that actually involves actual staffing plans to see how things are going more in the moment. And I guess what I've been looking at all this time is looking at the process. And, you know, some of the authors talk about process, structure. There are three things.
Outcomes.
Outcomes, thank you. We did look at some of those. I didn't look so much at outcomes.
Donna Bedian.
Yeah, Donna Bedian. And, but I looked at process things and I looked at structure things. And so we're going to analyze more of the process and structure things in the future. That's the end.
That's great.
Questions or? Yeah.
Is there a standard in nursing research for what constitutes an adequate percentage of return on a survey?
Well, that's an interesting question. As I said, I only did it one time, because like Don Dillman always talks about getting these stellar response rates of 95%, but you know, he does it a lot by harassment, because he actually sends things out 4 and 5 times to the same person. And he sends the last version out with registered mail and all that other stuff, so it's extremely expensive. I guess like a first round research, if you have 30% would be a very good return rate. And, you know, it depends on what it is that you're sending out and how complex it is. I mean, that had a lot of items in it. And filling the grid in the middle about how many workers, how much time, and all that other stuff, that had 64 items compressed onto one tiny little page. And I think that's where a lot of people kind of dropped off. But, oh, I didn't mention this. One of the things I thought as I was getting short of money for the second and third rounds was I decided I wanted approximately at least 200 responses, because I felt I needed like 200 to 300 responses at least to do some of the analyses, and especially, you know, the psychometrics and all that.
Right. Right.
But I would have liked to have had personally about 600 for all the different things that I wanted to do. And I got to an N of 429. So when I got my first response back, 13%, and I had a little, like about 125 or something from that, or 130 maybe, I guess, from that, because they sent out almost 1,000 on the first round. And I had those things coming back from the post office. They wouldn't send me things back. Then I had things that were sent back, patients deceased.
I'm surprised they just didn't charge you postage due and give you the.
I had 2 postage dues that did come through,
Yeah.
and one was sent from, I forgot where it was, but I only had 2 that were postage due. But I had other things that they sent this little thing from the post office that said that they wouldn't send it, that they had stuff and it was going into a dead letter file. So
I just wanted to confirm whether there was a standard, because in non-nursing research, a 10% return on a survey is considered pretty good.
Oh.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. What I've heard and learned is what you need to do is make a case that is reasonably representative of the population with anything you can show.
Right.
And what I don't think Debra did, although she does all of the details, is you can drop out those ones that are dead and your denominator gets smaller. So a lot of the things that we are so nursing to compel to be so honest that you don't even know if in those lists they send you, they're actually people that get to where they're going. So I think that if you get 10% back on a reasonably I don't think the Census Bureau hires people to go door to door
Right.
because there's just no way to be able to
Yeah.
guarantee
I mean,
that.
just from a purely
Thank you.
mathematical,
Thank you.
statistical
Yeah,
point
the
of
survey,
view,
the sociologists say
13%
10 to 15% is fine.
22% are
They're
pretty
fine.
good.
Larry, I would
Thank
say
you.
though, in a nursing situation, it's much more nuanced for a lot of things. If you're just doing a cold mail out for any survey, I know the 10% is what's considered not, an okay response. But in nursing, it depends a lot on what your topic is and how close to the nurses it is themselves. Like, I do all the violence in psychiatry. And I find that I get a good percentage of response when I mail to nurses who have been physically injured. That's real close to them and they want people to do research on it. So if my list is of people who have been reported injury within the last years or 2 years, whatever, I get a big response from that. But if it's just a general questionnaire, not so much. So I think it's very much what your topic is and even how long the survey is. And tell me about it.
Should I put this down somehow and then put
No,
my
keep it up.
my face up? Because my face
Oh,
isn't
but
there.
your face is out there anyway.
Oh, good. Okay.
It is. You just
All
can't
right.
see it.
All right. Fine.
That's fine. You can leave that there too.
Okay. All right.
They can't see that either. It's really funny. I know now what they can, what outside can and can't see.
Okay. So, did you have another question, Lois? Or?
No, I was just, it's much more, for Larry, general survey is one thing, something that's more nuanced
Yeah.
and focused on an audience.
Right, that's why I was wondering if the nursing profession had a higher standard survey.
No, but I did a survey to nurses with physicians in a grand survey with American Academy of Pediatrics list and the NAPNAP list.
Yeah.
And the American Academy of Pediatrics list had a 40% return rate because they did 3 rounds and did FedEx as returns and put $2 in each one. That's how they beefed up the return rate. The nursing return rate was 22% with 1 round FedEx return, which is strategy that I can tell you about sometime, that you only then pay for the ones that come back to keep your costs reasonable.
Yeah.
But they cost more per return, but you only pay for the ones that come back, like Business Reply, same thing. But the journal refused, it was a medical journal, to publish the nursing data because of the response rate. So again, nuanced, you're right. They just decided to set the standard as 40 was fine and 20 wasn't. However, as authors, the lead authors put the nursing findings, and that's because nurses did it better, frankly. I'm sorry. Did I say that? The results were that nurses did things better compared to physicians, and we had to drop that component of the analysis because the nursing return rate was 22%. There's no, Lois is right, it's nuanced and depending on what reviewers are going to want. And in Debra's, I think that return rate is probably fine. I don't think your reviewers cared about your return rate.
Right.
They cared about the complexity of analyses.
Right.
Yes, they didn't want
So
all the,
you need
they didn't
to-
have the figures and
How many tables? Yeah, no.
And she complained about the literature being
What
too
you
old.
have is a monograph as opposed to what most journals look, as an editor, it's page space. How many pages do you give something? And so you don't have to be as nuanced about it. And I wouldn't be that unhappy with 25%.
I didn't include the dead people as part of the responses, though.
No. And I'm saying that you can take off out of that 1,000, you can drop your denominator with those that never made it.
Oh, that's true.
And
Yeah,
then that
I
makes
see
the
what you're
response rate
The
go
ones that
up.
get returned.
yeah.
Point.
Okay.
I just
Yes.
think it's amazing coming, totally from the clinical perspective that the amount of time that we waste in doing just those things of, okay, I have 3 nurses to help me move my 500-pound patient, but I have to wait 3 minutes till the next nurse finishes what he or she is doing to come and join the group.
Right.
It's I don't even think about it, but it is staggering.
Yeah.
And another point, when you have really, really large patients like that, very often what we do is we'll let everybody know, like in report in the morning or now during a huddle or something like that, it's okay, we're all going to meet at so-and-so's bed at 2 o'clock or 1 o'clock or 11 o'clock, which kind of cuts down on some of that time. But, you have to be constantly aware of what you're doing because you're needed at 11 o'clock to, help
So
somebody
that
else.
prevents you sometimes from getting involved in something with your own patients because,
Exactly.
at 11 o'clock I have to do this.
Right.
Exactly. And just one more thing, and I don't even know how you measure this, is the prejudice that people have about moving patients that are that large for fear that they're going to hurt themselves, with that. I don't know how you would go about doing that, but that's an interesting.
I think, like for myself, in my own career, I think that when we had enough workers and we had enough equipment that was good, then the fear just subsides because then you feel safe.
Yes.
But that's why I said 6 workers seems reasonable to me.
Yeah.
And, 4 is definitely that I would feel nervous myself.
Yeah.
And, I was always, when I was a young nurse, particularly, I was very petite and, short and petite. So, I couldn't reach a lot of things, but you can't reach enough to turn a patient who is that large, and then everybody else wants their bed to be at hip height for them, and if the people around you are 6 feet tall, that's up to my waist, okay? That's not hip height for me anymore. So that's going to increase the danger. So those are some of the points that we want to bring up, but that I sort of felt a little bit, I don't know, rewarded in a sense, because the thing that I had said at that committee meeting was that the math was not right. And this is kind of finally doing the math, in a certain sense. And it's not perfect math because other people are out there doing a lot of other good research too. But I've seen enough other articles. There's a lady, nurse researcher, her last name is Rose, and she's done a lot of work on obesity and lifting and turning patients who are obese because she works in bariatric area, and her numbers for how long it takes to turn a patient, even when they have good equipment and enough staff, is close to what I had on my own report. So I think that it's not unreasonable, and I think, none of these nurses really knew each other getting the thing. I mean, I sent to all 50 states, and I got those reports back from people, and the handwritten notes, like you said about how dear it is to people. This is a topic that, of course, in 2008, pressure ulcers became the big never event, one of the many never events. And it's one of the things that CMS won't pay if you have a patient develop a pressure ulcer. So that became first and foremost on administrators' minds. And so it sort of carries with it a certain weight. And before that time, before it was a never event, it was always a stigma for nurses to have a patient with a pressure ulcer because it looks like you haven't done your work. And even Judith, didn't Florence Nightingale say the same thing in her writings? She said something about if the patient is not being turned in reposition, then the patient's going to show the effects of that. So, and she advocated for certain staffing on her units and how many beds and all that other stuff. So this is, I think it is a dear topic, but for me, the idea that there's an overlay of mental status, that there's an overlay of complexity of care, that there's so many overlays that are working together. And so it hasn't all been figured out, but this is just a little contribution to that knowledge.
It's fabulous. It's not a little contribution, it's fabulous.
Yeah, I mean, and it doesn't, the methodology can be applied because they're, in the NICU even though we don't have 400 or 500 pound patients, obviously. So lifting isn't an issue, but there are things where we need help to do. For example, a PICC line dressing change is not something in my unit that is done as a single person event. You need help, and it's the same thing. It's like, okay, at 11 o'clock we're going to do this, so you got to make sure, well, I can't start doing that because at 11 o'clock I have to do this. So I think you could take this same concept and, same type of research and apply it in many, many different areas, even those areas where you're not dealing with 500 pound patients.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think the other thing too, because now I'm hearing both of you, is that the lack of experience, when you're not experienced and you're a young nurse, you just do everything that's on your paper as you were told to do it. And then as you get older and gain more experience, and pretty soon you know how to strategize and prioritize in a completely different way that has nothing to do with your paper. And that's what this, making deals with people is all about in a way. So what's going to happen as we kind of age out of that, and then don't have enough experienced people who can do that kind of a negotiation,
Well, I want to see you get this. This is something that, I'm an advocate for practical applications of good scholarly work. The work's got to be scholarly, but the people who benefit the most are the people at the bedside. And what we have to do is get it in their hands. So I'm an advocate, a strong advocate, that what you have to do, which is tough to be a good scientist, is to be able to tell the story without the complexity of the math, other than do the math. And what you have are great visualization of what people know. It takes experience. Here it is. It shows it takes it. So my highest recommendation for you guys is to take slices of it. Now, salami science is when you put the whole shebang in one place and then take slices. And people frown on that. But slices before you go to press is fine. Take one piece of it, the 4 parts, and one piece to highlight. And that's the way you try and get it, multiple slices out of it into the clinician's hands. So the MedSurg Journal is a good start. Nursing economics is, because this translates to your findings of what you can say in a report submitted to, and then you can refer to it and write it with the practical charts that come from it. So that's my advice to you, to your team, to make it get into people's hands. It's very good.
Thank you. That's a good idea.
It's very good. Excellent.
So this was all looked at in the acute care setting. There wasn't an application to, people that have to go into long-term care.
No, but oh boy.
Well, I mean, because I'm just thinking about that, some of these individuals end up in the long-term care setting, and then the problem is they come back to the hospital with horrible pressure ulcers because the care there is so lacking in terms of staffing. And, they struggle with their reimbursement rates.
I think one of the things about, I've supervised in long-term care areas in my life, and, when you see that there are people who are very hardworking, but they're mostly CNAs, working like on a 60-bed unit, you might have, especially on the night shift, I remember the staffing being so slim as to have one registered nurse or one LPN nurse and like maybe 4 or 5 CNAs for 60 patients. And if you even have 8 or 10 CNAs, still a certified nursing assistant or nursing attendant doesn't have the knowledge to understand things and then to see what needs to be seen because they don't have assessment skills, they don't have a lot of other things. So the lack of knowledge in the nursing home industry itself or in the long-term care area is a problem. That's just my opinion, though. You know.
No, it is a problem.
That's
Yeah.
outstanding as an idea. That's outstanding. One of the things that they collect data on are the automated pieces of data that are now required. And so time to answer the bell is captured, and it's automated, and the CNAs step in the room, shut off the bell, and walk away. Seriously. But their data are great. Their data are great because they're within 1 minute of answering a call bell, because they believe that that's automated capture, and that's what Peg found too. With the automated capture. Just want to embellish on what you can say about Peg's
Peg did
use of.
such a beautiful study. And, Peg Duffy was doing her dissertation research at the same time that I was still struggling with all of this stuff. And her work was entirely different. She was looking at a computerized, a software package that looks at staffing. And then she looked at ratios that they have, determined in California. And she looked at perception of nurses, staffing, what the nurses thought about their shift for each shift. And so she looked at, 1,500 shifts, I think. And what she ended up with at the end, because she did a logistic regression, right? And that was where we found
Obesity, behavioral disturbances, the things that are not captured on any of those daily reports, that are the ones that nurses could misestimated what the staffing, or they didn't concur with the staffing report.
Yeah. And then we sort of had to
And family.
and family demands. When a family is very demanding. Bad behavior of the patient, family demands. There are a lot of things that she looked at, and we tried to.
ESL.
Language translation.
Oh,
is
language
not captured in
translation.
any of the software packages.
Yeah.
That we have to be in. That's what nursing needs to be able to
Yeah,
say.
and she only looked at it though if the patient actually had a translator, right? Because it wasn't like if the nurse thought the patient could have used a translator or something. There were a couple of other things but she was looking at things in a very clear way, so she did a very good job with her study. But at the end, when we were looking at all that stuff, then she kind of came to that conclusion that day that there was something else that had to do with the significance of her work, and that had to do with, I forgot what she called it, not accompaniment, but something like that. It was like
The number of people required to respond.
Yeah,
She changed the name of that couple of times.
Yeah, she
Yeah.
did. It had to do with the fact that when you have, for instance, if you need translation and you have a translator there, you're sort of getting a little bit of your own burden lifted because the translator is helping you. I think it's not accompaniment, I can't think of the word, it's sort of with an A. And she realized that the places that were the most significant were where people had to struggle alone. And that was mostly I think in family demands and,
Family.
and patient behavior, right?
There's not behavior, remember behavioral, and that stretches to Lois's of the kind of work where we can give it different names, but when it moves to the needing a one-on-one kind of person, that doesn't fit. That fits in, but if it doesn't get to that level of having a one-on-one staffing, one-to-one staffing, then it doesn't get into it. Yeah. And it's an incredible demand on nurses' time and the need for nurses.
And the other thing about that was that, the way I remember it was that when she looked at things like BMI or something like that, the obesity, as she pointed out, generally doesn't change much from day to day or from shift to shift, but a patient's behavior can change like in a couple of hours' time. And, family demands can suddenly escalate where they haven't been a thing that you would have predicted ahead of time, like for the shift, because all of a sudden people can just lose it and go out of control.
Well, they show up. They hadn't been there before.
Yeah. So there were a lot of things that, as we looked at her data, her data were kind of informing us about this. But this idea of coworker availability that came out in my study, and then the idea that she was lacking a coworker available for those things of family demands and the bad behavior, and that it's not a predictable item necessarily. Those were kinds of the things that sort of become like the nebulous stuff that is never planned when you're planning your staffing. And, you know, when we talk about planning the staffing, like I did shift-to-shift planning, but Peg was looking at it as a nurse administrator who was doing annual staffing plans, like how many FTEs will this unit get? And, you know, we talked about a lot of other possibilities over time, like how would you fix this? Because if you don't start out with enough FTEs to begin with, then you're never going to fix it. You're always behind the 8 ball. So, yeah.
It's great stuff.
Yeah.
It's really great stuff. I want you all to let everyone in outside. Look, we got a whole crew of folks who joined in. Thank you very much. Thank you. And I'm sure she'll stay a little bit and talk to people, and I'll shut off the recorder.
Did everyone receive a survey assignment?
Yep.
Yes.